Hello, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us all this morning. My name's Emma Beck, and I'm one of the programme leads with my colleague Kirsten Walton at the St Mellitus Organ Restoration Project. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this wonderful talk and Q&A session that we're hosting with Professor Clyde Binfield. I just wanted to give you a little bit of an explanation about how this talk came about. It's thanks to Karen Brookfield, who is a member of our group of incredibly industrious and committed volunteer archive researchers. As a group, we've been meeting every month on Zoom most recently to share skills and peer support as we've set about uncovering some of the stories behind the names on the plaques. Our research has generated lots of questions about the church during the war and the people that attended it. So Karen thought to seek out an expert. So step forward, Professor Binfield. Professor Binfield is Professor Emeritus in History at the University of Sheffield. He's also the author of several books and innumerable articles, chiefly on the history of the Protestant Nonconformity, with reference to its social, cultural and architectural context. We're absolutely delighted to have him here today to talk about the nature of this particular North London church and congregation, with a focus on the period of the First World War. At the end of the session, there'll be time for questions from the floor. So please put those in the chat if you would like to pose a question, and I will compile them at the end and we'll pose them to Professor Binfield. But without further ado, we'll hand the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Emma, very much for that introduction. And I suppose the only appropriate thing to say now is this is my over-the-top moment. I want to recreate for you a congregational church, which is what the building of St Mellitus housed between 1871 and 1959. Today, British Congregationalism is largely found in the United Reformed Church, originally a union back in 1972 of most English and Welsh Congregationalists with the Presbyterian Church of England. But Congregationalism itself had been directly traceable from the earlier 17th century, and some would convincingly push back to the 16th century. In the later 16th century, the word separatist was often used to describe them. Then increasingly the word independent. The Pilgrim Fathers who sailed in the Mayflower were independents. Oliver Cromwell and his sort were independents. After the Restoration of 1660, many of those who could not go along with the reconstituted Episcopal Church or a national church of that sort, or indeed of any sort, dissented from it, refusing to conform to it, formed their own congregations, many of them, as independents, Congregationalists, as they increasingly called themselves. Now, you probably don't really want to hear any of this, but it does have a direct bearing on the people who worshipped here in the church you've seen, and the church we will imagine that we are actually in, until 1959, and on the name of the building, New Court Congregational Church. But what was a congregational church? It was a covenanted fellowship of men and women who, in that place, were the church in all its fullness. They were autonomous, that is to say, self-regulating. They met monthly in church members' meeting to regulate membership matters, spiritual matters, everyday matters. They elected a group of deacons. 12 was an obvious number, sometimes elected for life or indeterminately, sometimes for shorter periods, often 3 years in rotation. And they acted as a sort of cabinet. Church and deacons' meetings called a minister. Sometimes the call was strengthened by the votes of regular worshippers, subscribers at Sunday services who were not church members. But never forget the distinction between members and others in the congregation who were adherents or attenders. It was the former, the members, who were the church. Local churches by Victorian days were federated in county associations. London had such a body, and all came together in a national congregational union whose annual meetings each May and again in the autumn each October were joyous occasions. Now, I go into all this detail because I hope you can see how a distinctive mindset is evolving, representative, not democratic, but well on its way to being democratic, consultative. No wonder people with this sort of mindset found themselves in the 19th century on local councils or on countless committees. No wonder that phrase, the nonconformist conscience, came into being to express both ways of seeing the proper conduct of civic affairs and the belief that it really was possible to moralize a nation into right and good paths. And such attitudes de-anonymized, you might say, that rapidly advancing fact of respectably anonymous Victorian and Edwardian city life, the suburb. And it's time now to brave such a suburb. In 1904, a social explorer called Richard Moody Smith edited a book called The Religious Life of London, a wonderful mix of essays and statistics and maps. And its chapter 5 was called The Problem of North London. And in it, Walter R. Warren, LLB, a man with a splendidly robust Edwardian style, described the 6 boroughs of North London, dovetailing, he said, into one another like the pieces of a child's wooden picture puzzle. Let me remind you of those 6 with his brisk descriptions. St Pancras, long and straggling. Wealthy Hampstead. Dreary and depressing Islington. Progressive Stoke Newington. Low and larcenous Finsbury. And solid, squalid Holborn. In these 6 boroughs in 1901 lived over 860,000 people, and over a third of them lived in dreary and depressing Islington, a place becoming every day more a caravanserai of ever-shifting lodgers. Well, of course, even at its most dreary and depressing, Islington could never quite be taken for granted. Not when it encompassed Barnsbury, Canonbury, Highbury, Holloway, up to Tollington Park, wave upon wave of attractive villadom as the 19th century progressed and turned into the 20th century, intensifying beyond belief, congealing, yet never quite shedding its villa veneer. Here were slums. Here on its margins were leafy purlieus. And here beyond doubt was Pooterland. Tollington Park was prime Pooterland. But always in its higher reaches, there was the promise of those leafy purlieus. And here, beyond peradventure, was chapel, Baptist, Methodist, and perhaps most adventurous of all, Congregationalist. I guess that Walter Warren, LLB, was himself a Congregationalist, so he was biased. Even so, he insisted that here the Congregationalists have a very strong hold. Total aggregate Sunday attendances considerably over 11,500, more and more giving the lead in North London, both in methods and kinds of organisation, especially in the well-to-do parts. And he itemised in Islington 15 churches, 4 missions, and he focused on 4 in particular. He was rather good at this, and I want to pick up on them. Finsbury Park Congregational Church, 876 adults on a Sunday evening. Mostly, he says, shopkeepers, shop assistants, artisans, mechanics, and clerks. An audience good-hearted, industrious, and impressionable, fond of tea meetings and hymns with good swinging tunes, and not averse from a sally of wit or flash of sparkling humour. Union Chapel, Islington, Upper Street, 786 on a Sunday morning. A totally different class of audience. Interesting, he uses the word audience, not congregation. Famous for excellent singing. Its vitality is still very vigorous. The preaching is effective and appeals especially to an intellectual audience. Highbury Quadrant, 650 adults on a Sunday evening. A robust and healthy state of things. Here again, it is the man, the minister, who draws. He appeals to people who think and read. And then, further north, the 4th of them, we reach New Court, Tollington Park, a church of historic value, capable of holding 1,200 to 1,400 people, wholly composed of middle-class residents and tradespeople. Now, what it actually held that Sunday in 1904 were 270 men, 287 women, 177 children in the morning. Of course, most children would have been elsewhere in the Sunday school rooms. 239 men, 362 women, 32 children in the evening. An aggregate of 1,367 men, women, and children. Of course, some of them twice as. Now let me quote some more. I can remember, he writes, the overcrowded assemblies of this church 14 or 16 years ago under the leadership of the Reverend Ossian Davis. And I note that there is an Ossian Road not so far from Tollington Park. I wonder if it's named after him. A man whose druidic fervour impressed the mind and heart. Rhetoric, poetry, argument, personal experience, living conviction, divine passion and compassion, all shot like well-winged arrows, or falling magnificently as white snow before a winter wind. And then for a few years too, he goes on, this church has been the scene of the Reverend G. Campbell Morgan's successful labours, from pulpit steps to doors and from floor to gallery, full to overflowing, morning and evening, with no hope for latecomers. In each case, unquestionably, it has been the personality of the man that has secured these extraordinary attendances. And although the numbers have not been anything like as great since the departure of Dr. Campbell Morgan, they are still very good. The place has acquired a kind of spiritual goodwill in the neighbourhood. Its people religiously resort to it, and even weeknight services are well attended. Now, I think that that lands us right in front of the fine portico of St Mellitus, opened formally on a wet September day in 1871. Grandly Corinthian, unashamedly expensive. I've seen the figure of £13,000 mentioned, including the site. State-of-the-art acoustically for preaching and for oratorios and organ music. Well equipped with ancillary accommodation for daily activities, a basement hall underneath, schools, etc., 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 behind, and kept in repair, enlarged and improved in 1884. And I know that Bridget Cherry in the Pevsner volume mentions Art Nouveau electroliers. When did they appear? And it had an architect, of course, Charles Gray Searle, 1816 to 1881, probably at his peak. 2 sons and a grandson were architects, their practice extending for rather more than 100 years, certainly from 1841, perhaps into the 1950s, even the 1960s. This Mr. Searle could try his hand at anything. He competed for Manchester's Assize Court, for London City Mission, and for workhouses in West London and Lambeth. He could try his hand at any style of architecture, a Romanesque Baptist church at Coleford in Gloucestershire, a Gothic Baptist church still there for Heath Street in Hampstead. And yes, he was himself a nonconformist, active in the 1850s at Bloomsbury Baptist Church, very close to his practice office. By 1870, however, he was living in Tollington Park, and in the 1870s, he would be a leading figure in the Congregational church that he designed for that swiftly growing suburb. He was a deacon. He was its first Sunday school superintendent, with, it seems, an especial gift for winning the young people. And one of his sons, Frank, followed him as a deacon. But why did he go all Corinthian? All the other great Congregational Northumberland chapels were in shades of Gothic. John Sulman's Highbury Quadrant, James Cubit's Union Islington, still magnificently there, Lander and Bedell's Park Chapel, Crouch End, John Tyring's Stamford Hill, even Searle's other localish church, Finsbury Park Congregational. So why Corinthian here? I have a hunch, it's only a hunch, I can't prove it. In 1859, Searle, in his Baptist phase, competed for the Metropolitan Tabernacle, built south of the river for the huge congregations gathering to hear Charles Haddon Spurgeon. And Spurgeon specified a classical tabernacle, tent of meeting, for his church, since Greek was the language of the New Testament. Searle lost out in the composition to a Methodist, W. Pocock, but I suspect he adapted his design, I just wonder, to the requirements of Tollington Park. Now, who were the people of this church and congregation? I would judge that the bulk of them were all shadings of the lower middle classes. There was a working class outreach to the mission Lennox Road. There was also a middle class professional and commercial veneer. Leading lights in the diaconate and membership had, I note, addresses in Tollington Park, Crouch Hill, Hornsey Rise, Tufnell Park, Stamford Hill, Finsbury Park. I haven't noted many famous congregational names, any literary or ministerial or financial ones among them, but some certainly ring bells. The Gauntlets, for instance. These, I am sure, mean music. Allen and Gauntlet in its day had been a book of psalms and hymns used at Union Chapel, where the congregation, as a matter of course, sang each Sunday in 4-part harmony. Some gauntlets were found at Tollington Park. And then I pick on the name of Winifred Howell, noting the Welshness of her name in passing. For 40 years, she would run Campbell Morgan's office, as it were, wherever he was. And she was brought up at New Court, daughter of a fine musician, as it was recalled. And who, I just ask this, follow it up for me, who was E.J. Butt of Ivy Lodge, Crouch Hill? I hope he was in coal. And I would love to discover that he was related to Dame Clara Butt, that contralto to end all contraltos, 6 foot 2 inches in her socks, who was certainly a Kensington Chapel person. Did Dame Clara ever sing for New Court, Tollington Park? I just wonder. Perhaps this is a pure flight of fancy. And now I must pull ends together to enable me to come to the Great War and the memorial organ and your project. But first, another word about ministers. New Court, Tollington Park had, I think, 7 ministers between 1871 and 1920. One of these was nationally known and one was internationally known. Their ministries here were short but striking, and I return to them now because the age of the pulpit prince has now quite vanished, and those two were pulpit princes. Ossian Davis, I've already mentioned him, was one such. At New Court, 1883 to 1888, one of his deacons, the son of one of his deacons, was still church secretary in 1920. I've already given you a sense of his allure. Extraordinarily, he wrote his sermons, which was not supposed to be the done thing. And yet, apparently, he could hold a crowded congregation in his grip for 45 minutes and always seemed to have 25% more sermons in his notes than he gave to the congregation. And then, one Sunday in March 1887, he preached in Bournemouth, Church Richmond Hill, that was to become famous. The news got round that he might be prepared to settle there because of his son's health. And so the Bournemouth folk issued a call. New Court would not hear of it. A church members' meeting was attended by 700 church members, and congregation. The membership then was about 900. They promised him a winter house on the south coast and freedom from any weekday work so that he could care for his son if only he would stay. Still, the Bournemouth people pressed. And in September 1888, he began a 9-year ministry in Bournemouth, which saw almost immediately a fine Gothic church built there for £14,000. The internationally famous minister was Campbell Morgan. He was 34 when he came to New Court, only there for 4 years, 1897 to 1901. But it was at New Court that he became so well known that the United States beckoned insistently to him, and he crossed over. He was theologically much more conservative than most of his congregational contemporaries, but his power lay in his expository preaching, and I remember my father had lots of Campbell Morgan books on his bookshelf. It was said that in his time, congregations filled the chapel an hour before service began. I want to give you two snapshots of him. First, a snapshot of the dashing pulpit celebrity. It was not unusual for Campbell Morgan to preach at New Court on Sunday or deliver a Bible lecture on Wednesday evening and go straight from the church to the station to board a train for the west of England or the south of Scotland, the Isle of Man or Welsh coast, where he would speak 3 or 4 times and go back to London for the next scheduled service in his own pulpit. And then, second snapshot, Edwardian congregational churches embraced an organization for young people called Christian Endeavour. And here young men and women met on equal terms and learned to speak in public on equal terms. My grandmother met my grandfather at a Christian Endeavour meeting. Campbell Morgan introduced for his young people a Christian Endeavour meeting after the midweek service. It was, he said, to give shop assistants, students, professional young people and others an opportunity for worship and recreation. Now, suburban congregations were in constant flux. So were suburban populations. But at least I hope that I've given you the chemistry, the mulch, the mindset behind those young names on your war memorial, the boards of your war memorial. And you have even so perhaps sensed that without the caesura of the Great War, an era of this church's history was already passing, perhaps had passed. 50 years of it were approaching. And before I pass on, I want just to pause at that word history, just briefly. Why New Court? In 1892, William Pierce, whose ministry slipped in between those of Ossian Davis and Campbell Morgan, produced a slim volume, Old New Court, the story of an old London nonconformist church. Cloth boards, gilt top, 1 and 6pence, 7.5p. And in it he traced its history back to 1662. You see, there had been just over 200 years of previous existence between Covent Garden and Strand, for most of that time in New Court, Carey Street, served by a stately succession of dissenting divines, Daniel Burgess, Thomas Bradbury, Richard and Robert Winter. Thomas Bradbury really was a grandee among parsons, and his successors, the 2 Winters, were related to him. It was a family business. Their apostolic succession came to an end in 1866, 65, 66, when New Court made way for the law courts on the Strand. And the remnant congregation, much depleted, with rather generous compensation, £7,500, struck out eventually for Tollington Park, where within the year before 1870, 1,000 new houses had been built, and where a new congregation was all but in readiness. So you see how it is that in that name, New Court, history is subsumed into tradition, such as might fuel a genuine forward movement in a new, rapidly growing part of town. And then fast forward to the Great War. war had a dual impact on the Congregationalists of Tollington Park. From one point of view, the adaptation to a wartime situation was surprisingly seamless. Young men volunteered from August 1914. They were conscripted from 1916. It was the nation's call. It was their answer to the call of duty. And perhaps we underestimate how the language of war had become omnipresent in the past decades, certainly spurred on by the Boer War. It colored journalism. It fired gripping yarns and popular stories. It came naturally to hymns and the chivalry of stained glass windows. Fight the good fight, soldiers of Christ arise. It was there in temperance crusades. The fight against evil was part of the appeal and the story of overseas missions. There was a religious dimension probably taken totally for granted in the rhetoric of war. Yet it was also a shock for everything that Congregationalism and Congregationalists stood for. The last 20 years and more had been years of peace movements. One of the oldest organized good causes for decades had been that of the Peace Society. Victorian and Edwardian Congregationalism fostered a mindset which thought of crusades, but crusades for peace and justice. The nonconformist conscience, too, was politically a bastion of liberalism. And in 1914, the Liberals were in power just at Westminster. The Prime Minister, Asquith, had been reared a Congregationalist. His successor, Lloyd George, would be a Baptist. Their cabinets were full of chapel goers. And something else. The people who had voted those chapel goers into power were essentially unmilitary, whatever their rhetoric. The army was for them a career only if all else failed. You can begin to see what a shock war would be and the extent to which it crystallized attitudes that were far in the background. Let me end with one example, not a local one to you. In May 1915, the chairman of the Congregational Union of England and Wales was a layman, Sir Arthur Howarth. He was a Manchester businessman, a yarn merchant whose business, as it happened, did particularly well out of the war. He was a patriot who commanded a home battalion of his local regiment. He was also a progressive politician who before the war had been a Liberal MP and after the war would be a firm supporter of the League of Nations. And he was in appearance the very model of a choleric colonel, a Congregational Colonel Blimp. Now, his minister, in a very attractive and prosperous Cheshire suburb of Manchester, was a man called Leighton Richards, compellingly liberal in theology, radical in social vision, and a pacifist. Howarth and Richards remained lifelong friends. I think I'm right in saying that Richards officiated at Howarth's funeral. But in 1915 to 16, the tensions were such that Howarth went to worship at his local parish church, though that, it has to be said, was jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, since the incumbent of the parish church was himself a fiery pacifist, Hewlett Johnson, the future Red Dean of Canterbury. But you see, this is the sort of situation in which conscientious objection will come to the fore, not least with conscription. That was when young men with no military hinterland were compelled to fight, if necessary, to kill and be killed. Could there be any room for a conscientious objection to this? Surely there had to be, even if there was no precedent for it. And that was an issue which, effectively, Howarth grappled in his chairman's addresses in 1915. He was an old-style liberal with a visceral dislike of compulsion of any sort, in a world in which compulsion had overnight, as he admitted, become normal in many areas of life. He was also a patriot. Men like him would man and chair the tribunals which were to consider the claims of conscientious objectors. And some of those, many of those, were young men brought up in the churches of which the tribunal contained deacons. No easy answers were found. Individual lives were scarred. But in time, the recognition of conscientious objection might be seen as one of the more civilized outcomes of what we still sometimes call the Great War. And all of that culminates for Newcourt, now St Mellitus, in the finest of organs currently under restoration. And here I think I might end. There are various aspects sort of bugging me still to follow up, but perhaps this is a point for opening to discussion. Emma, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure I'm speaking for everybody who's saying that. I know I've already got some people who would like to ask questions. I wonder if I could ask one initially, actually, Professor Binfield. I had a question about the specific choice of an organ as a war memorial. Is that something you could elaborate on a little bit for us?
Well, not particularly. It seemed to me to be a completely natural thing to do. It could well be that in a church which I guess had a very good choral tradition and I guess had a strong musical tradition, organs need to be given tender, loving care. There could be nothing more dramatic in that building than a good organ behind the pulpit. And it is, I would like to know more about, how many of those young men, possibly some of them at least, have been in the choir and so on. So I think it's a natural thing.
Fantastic. Well, I've got a few people who've already said they would like to ask questions. So the first person is Rosamond. Would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Thank you very much. That was fantastically insightful talk, really interesting. You mentioned quite early on that it wasn't the done thing to have written sermons. I wondered if you could elaborate on exactly what you mean by that and the history of that, how that came to be not a done thing, and then what people did after that. Thank you.
Well, I think I know there are people listening here who could go into this more than I could. I think the thing is that when you are preaching the word, you mustn't be constrained by a text, as I have been constrained in talking to you. And just as in your long prayers, extempore prayer is not anything that comes to you at mind, on the spur of the moment. You wrestle in prayer beforehand in preparation for the service. And your extempore prayer in a way has been prepared for. So with the sermon. And of course, if you're reading from a sermon, it can get provide a barrier between you and your people. I always say that the vital thing when you go into any nonconformist church is to look at it from the gallery and also to look at it from the pulpit. And the man in the pulpit from 1917, it could be the woman in the pulpit, would have eye contact with all the congregation. It fascinates me at church on a Sunday when we have ministers who do not engage. Now, I am guilty of this. I cannot speak without a prepared text for fear that I will go completely blank and forget it. Ever since the occasion when as a boy, I was supposed to lead in the Lord's Prayer, and I totally forgot the Lord's Prayer. So it has been written down for me word for word ever since. Now, clearly there is an enormous power of acting in the nonconformist minister. Indeed, I think famous actors used to be told, go and see how Spurgeon handled things at Metropolitan Tabernacle. And Ossian Davis clearly had this great ability, and Campbell Morgan. So they were able, you see, Ossian Davis, although he wrote his sermons, I think he lived his sermons. There is another thing that comes out from this that might possibly be behind part of your question. One of the great sort of publishing certainties was books of sermons. Well, of course, they are written in joined up sentences, but it does lead one to think, were those sermons subsequently compiled from notes? How were they actually delivered? What was actually said as opposed to what is being read? But I suppose if Ossian Davis's were read, he could, A, he gripped people, but B, he could also look back to say, well, what I actually said was this.
Roger, you had a question, I believe.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Clyde. I wanted to raise the issue of the link between Sunday school attendance and membership and volunteering with regard to the First World War. My feeling is that in Sunday schools during the Edwardian era, and many of the volunteers would have been through Sunday school, there was a very heavy emphasis on the importance of not simply religious education, but also preparation for what could be broadly described as citizenship. And the importance of respect for authority, obedience, discipline, and so on. And that some of those values may have been absorbed by Sunday school children. The expectation would be that they were. And then at the 1914, that would be translated into a willingness to volunteer for military service.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And if in addition to Sunday schools, you begin to think of the emergence of uniformed organizations, boys' brigades, for example, Boys' Life Brigade, Scouts are beginning, and indeed going away to camp. So yes, that is right. And I'm just getting in front of me, I've got the Congregational Yearbook for 1921 in front of me, and I note that even then, Tollington Park, it has a membership of 820, which is pretty good still, and a huge Sunday school, 554 children on its books with 62 teachers and 10 lay preachers. And the Lennox Road Mission, which at that point they do not give a separate membership for, had 226 6 in its Sunday schools. So it was very much a much smaller building, but a significant school with 21 teachers. So when you think that the teachers would meet, they would be prepared. The Sunday school is, I also like to think of as a sort of separate dominion in the church commonwealth. And this was very much so at New Court.
Okay, thank you.
Karen, you've got a question, haven't you, for Professor Binfield?
Yes, thank you, Emma. Thank you, Professor Binfield, that absolutely wonderful talk. I wonder if I could pick up something I've noticed in my researches. 13 of our soldiers who died named on our plaque are also on the war memorial in St Mark's Anglican Church in Tollington Park.
Mm.
And I wondered about that, about the relationships between Congregationalists and the Anglicans. And I noticed also in the service records of quite a few of my soldiers that very few actually give Congregationalism as their faith. They often actually are, or perhaps wasn't recorded properly, but it very often does say Church of England. And I wondered about this relationship.
Well, I can't directly address that. As to very few, what I think is that the names, the very large number of names on your war memorial boards would include, I think, all young men who had at any point been noted as having some association with the Sunday school, with the church, with weeknight meetings. They may well not have been regular attenders. Few of them would have been actual members, but there would have been a link. And that, I think, can easily explain the sort of appearance of some of them on the war memorial in the parish church. So that is the first thing that comes to me. On the fact that very few of them would be put down as Congregationalists, I can well imagine that a tired person writing them down would find it very hard to spell Congregationalist and, well, your C of E.
Thank you.
Over relations with the parish church, this varied. This would vary, I think, very much depending on the style, the lowness or the highness or the breadth of the parish church. I didn't quote, there's a lovely quote about Campbell Morgan's time by a nearby Baptist, Charles Brown, great Baptist minister, I think, of Fern Park Church. And he rather ruefully wrote of the impact of the coming of Campbell Morgan on some of the less attached members of his congregation who would go and sermon taste at New Court and then go back and tell Dr. Brown how wonderful Dr. Morgan was. So I think there's that sort of relationship. Yes, in some cases, though, I think there was, in some instances, I'm not so convinced that this would have been so necessarily at Newport. There would be increasingly good relationships between Anglican parsons and congregational ministers, but that was a matter of personal chemistry, I think.
Thank you.
Great. David Norton, I think you had a question you wanted to ask, didn't you?
I did, thanks, Emma. Sorry, my Wi-Fi dropped out about 5 minutes ago and I've been desperately trying to rejoin, so I hope I'm not about to ask something that was just asked in the last few minutes. But it's a fabulous talk. Thank you ever so much, Professor. I'm going to have to rewatch it to digest all the information. It's very rich, but it's really incredible to find out so much about the church. I wanted to ask about the rhetoric of war, and I've seen a couple of documents that talk about the great sermons that were preached in congregational churches. And I wondered if you could say any more about how much influence that had on people volunteering, signing up, and whether that would have differed from other churches at the time.
I think it would be fairly similar in all the churches. I think congregational ministers, if they were good pastors, would have been aware of the tensions in the congregation and in their own lives, and of the sheer shock that this involved. Something I didn't bring in that I'll just put in here. There was a sense of almost of intellectual betrayal for some of the fact that there was fighting Germany, not that they approved of the German political system, but Germany intellectually and theologically was a place where some of them had trained or spent a year, you know, as part of their training. And those were links with German universities that were not easily repaired after the Great War, Göttingen, Heidelberg, Berlin. So that is an element to bring in of the tensions. The rhetoric. I gave a lecture a few years ago. I wanted to see what the Congregational Union's representative figure, the men who were chairman of the union, most of whom were ministers, what colored their addresses, annual addresses, in the May meetings and the autumnal meetings in the course of the Great War. And what struck me, and I looked again at what I said then, what struck me was that in one case, there was something approaching, not jingoism, nothing as crude as that. In fact, I was surprised, or not surprised, rather encouraged, I think, by the care of the wording and the attitudes that were taken. But there was a sense that this was a national duty, that the response to something that was unimaginably terrible must nonetheless be faced. And this was something that one could see being grappled with, you know, a rather more, it's hard to use the word subtle when you're addressing several hundred people or whatever, but there was a more subtle and nuanced approach to the rhetoric than I had expected. And when one realizes that at least two of those men had lost their sons in the war, you can begin to see something that is having an impact.
Thank you very much, Professor.
We had a similar question from Jean Sylvan-Evans. Jean, did that answer cover the question, or did you have another point you wanted to make? Jean, I think you're on mute. If you need to unmute yourself.
I think I'm finished now. Hello, Clyde.
Hello, Jean. Yes.
What I was saying was that our own predecessor church, which is Charles Street Congregational Church in Cardiff, was really quite jingoistic, and it sort of talk about it as a religious duty to go. It had a roll of honor with all of the names of the people serving, and it kept in touch with all of their people serving, and made a big fuss on the fact that they were serving and the indication that they should be serving. And what my question was I knew this, but I just wondered how typical of that was. And I can see from what you're saying that it wasn't typical. I think perhaps he was one of the more extreme people involved.
I think, Jean, it was what you're describing. Well, it might have been, but I think the general attitude was certainly not untypical. I think that in all churches, I suspect you'll find both attitudes, and they live with great difficulty with each other. I mean, I'm thinking here of somebody who became a congregational minister after the Great War, who was a conscientious objector during the war, and he found it very difficult in his home church and moved to another church in Sheffield. So, you know, this can be replicated again and again. I think there's no doubt about that. And of course, in a way, I suppose, the people who collect money for overseas missions are going to knit socks for our boys who are their sons, remember. So this, you know, this is a natural part of church life. And again, I think we do come back to the personality of the minister. In a congregational church, you must always realize that, you know, it is not minister dominated, and yet how important the ministers are. One begins to think of the impact of Leighton Richards on his particular church, pacifist minister I mentioned. There was in the Kingsway House in London, which, like New Court, had originally been a very famous old dissenting church, moved to near Grosvenor Square. Today it's still there as the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral. And during the war, the minister of the Kingsway House Church was a man who will be known to many here, W.E. Orchard, who was a pacifist. But he attracted many serving men on leave to services on Sunday. Asquith, who remained enough of a Congregationalist to like a good sermon, would quite enjoy sitting under W.E. Orchard from time to time. So, you know, Orchard was a remarkable man. And from the point of view of St Mellitus, he eventually became a Roman Catholic priest.
Fantastic. I've got another question here from, sorry, I don't know your first name, but your Zoom name is the Ratkins, sorry.
That's right. Sorry, I'm Stephen Ratkin.
Stephen.
Yes, my question is really that in my own church, we actually have church meeting minutes of people resigning from the church because of, quotes, the church's attitude to the war. One couple actually went to join, it's quoted, the Friends Church instead. And I just wondered to what extent there are records in other churches, New Court or any others for that matter, of similar defections, if you like, because of this sort of tension and splits of this sort.
Oh, I'm sure this is a story in many churches, and it depends how well minutes were kept, I think, as to how these are kept. Two things occur to me listening to you. One, so you're the first person, I think, to have mentioned Quakers, Friends. And I think we need to remember that for the Society of Friends, the issue of war, pacifism as opposed to pacificism, had not confronted them in this way before. And it was not automatic for a large number of Quaker young men that they would conscientiously object. I think some served, for others there was a Friends ambulance unit and so on. So that, I think, you know, they were facing tensions themselves. I see it's unfair of me to look at David Thompson, but I noticed David Thompson here and from the Church at Emmanuel, Cambridge, where certainly some prominent people, members, left the congregation, left the church because of the attitude of the minister, Henry Child Carter, to the war. He was a pacifist. And among them, there was the historian Holland Rose, for example. But I think David could come in with more detail on that than I could at the moment.
I'm not sure if you want to, David. Are you just enjoying listening? You're muted at the moment, David. Just unmute.
Yes, well, I mean, the story of Emmanuel Cambridge is a fascinating illustration of the way in which Congregationalism could work, in the sense that the deacons wanted Henry Carter to go, and that recommendation to the church meeting was overturned by the church meeting by quite a considerable majority, with the result that more or less all of the deacons resigned. And that illustrates what could happen if tensions rose to an intolerable level. Carter, of course, began by supporting rather hesitantly the war, and then changed his position. And this was something which not infrequently happened, and it complicated the way in which personal relationships in a congregation could work out. Not everybody had such a happy relationship as the one between Leighton Richards and Alfred Hewitt.
And picking up on that, thank you very much for that, David, because it brings out something very powerful of the chemistry, which doesn't always work in a congregational church. Picking up on that, Carter, of course, carried on with a very remarkable ministry at Emmanuel Cambridge. Legendary, one can use the word, after the war.
There's more questions. There's still more questions for you if you're happy, Professor Binfield. But John Hinshelwood, you had a question, didn't you?
Yes, I was interested in the distinction you make between the membership of the Congregational Church and its wider congregation. And I was wondering if you could explain what constituted the membership as opposed to the followers and general congregation.
Well, the members are those who are received into church membership on profession of faith, and they are listed in the list of members. They are the ones whose duty it is, responsibility it is to go to church members' meeting. And they are the people who are listed in statistics in the yearbook, which in the case of the congregational yearbooks are chiefly from the beginning of the 20th century. Statistics aren't given much before then. So, you know, there is this important distinction. Very often there would be meetings of church and congregation, so that a sense of, you know, general feeling, often this would apply to the calling of a minister. The minister would preach with a view, church meeting would vote and whether to give him a call unanimously or whatever. And sometimes, not invariably, there would be a meeting of church and congregation to confirm this.
I know that, Karen, you had another question, didn't you, that's come about through your industrious research on the project?
Yes, thank you, Emma. Professor Binfield, I have noticed in my research that quite a few soldiers who are named on the plaques, either those who died or those who came back, have brothers who also served but are not necessarily named. In one or two instances, it seems to be obvious that the brothers had moved away, and whether they went to church elsewhere, we don't know, but that seems sort of obvious. But with one or two of the others, I wondered whether any, what one might call moral judgments were made about the inclusion of men who had returned on those plaques, whether anyone thought about what they had done or not done. Do you think that's possible, or is it purely a practical question that they were not local?
I think there must be a mix of answers to that. One might be simply the difficulty when dealing with such large numbers of remembering who's put in, especially if the links of some of them, you know, had been a few years earlier and had ceased or moved. So that comes into it. There is a very interesting one, perhaps this is my fevered imagination. Were there any instances of cowardice or desertion that would have barred people from being remembered? There is that sort of painful distinction. In some churches, too, there was the question raised of what about women who served fairly actively? And of course, these are all men. So there are a variety of things that are bound to come to mind. And something that struck me, and I think you might well follow through, the man who was minister at the time of the organ board came in 1917. And I think the church had been without a minister for at least the previous 2 years. There is, one would like to know, his predecessor, Hill, had not been there for terribly long. One just wonders what story there might be. 1914 to 1917. And the membership at that time, which had peaked to, I think, in its prime at just over 1,000, in Ossian Davis' time was 900. The wartime, still very respectable, 700. And then under Ward, it comes up to 820. So I think there is something there to follow up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that is absolutely fascinating, because we do want to think about looking more widely at the local history and what's happening. So that's given us lots of leads as well to follow up. Thank you.
I wondered if I might be able to ask one more question as well, about, you mentioned in your talk about the mission that New Court set up on Lennox Road. On the paperwork that we've seen, that the original paperwork for the organ, there are some sort of pencil doodles next to some of the names that seem to indicate that some of the soldiers commemorated were connected to the mission rather than to New Court. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the relationship between New Court and the mission and the attendees of those individual places. Is it likely that people from the mission would have even ever heard the organ at St Mellitus? Oh, sorry, not St Mellitus. New Court as it was, now St Mellitus, sorry.
Oh, I think it is possibly likely, yes, at the opening and so on, but relationships with missions are always very interesting, because they were very often either run by an assistant minister or the missioner. They were very consciously aimed at a working class congregation. there was sometimes quite a severe distinction between the main church and the mission. I can give an illustration here. When my grandmother was a young woman, she acted as a companion to two ladies who lived in Fitzjohn's Avenue, Hampstead, and were pillars of Lyndhurst Road, Hampstead, a famous congregation of the church at the time. And they were rather insistent that my grandmother would go to the mission run by the church. And my grandmother was not going to do that. So she went down and became a member of a famous Congregational church right in the centre of London. Christchurch, south of the river, Christchurch, Westminster Bridge Road. So, you know, there are all these class elements figuring in most churches that you step on where you least expect to find them.
No, that's fascinating. That sort of echoes what we sort of, our research is beginning to sort of suggest. I've put a little message on the chat to ask if anybody has any further questions, or raise your hand. I can't see everybody, but if you do pop your hand up. Oh, Kirsten.
Hello, thanks very much for the talks. Really fascinating. I really like the idea that some of our soldiers may have been singing in the choir at the church, and I wondered if you could paint us a bit of a picture of the distinct character of the choral tradition at a Congregational church.
Well, they were choirs of fearsome beasts, choirs and organists. Ministers deal with them with great care. And many of these churches, which were acoustically designed on the whole for the preaching of the word, were ideal for a choral tradition. The oratorio, I bet that New Court had regular oratorios. There was the Free Church Choral Union that, I think, if I'm right, had great sings in the Crystal Palace when it moved to Sydenham. So this, I remember coming up to Sheffield being horrified that in northern churches, Congregational churches, choirs seemed to be paid, which struck me as very wicked that you'd have quite paid choir. But the singer, usually Madam so-and-so, soprano, contralto, would services of song. This was part of a very real aspect of culture. I was interested that Warren was referring to they liked at Finsbury Park swinging tunes, hearty swinging singing, whereas at Union Islington you sang in 4-part harmony, and the organist there was a man who followed Gauntlet, was a man called Fountain Mean, who was nationally known. You know, this was a very serious part of chapel life. Baptist, Methodist, and Congregational.
Thank you. That's really interesting, really useful too to us. Thank you.
Can I just make a comment about music? The hymn book, Congregational Hymnary, which I think was published around about 1915 or 1917, something like that, has a huge section in the back dedicated to anthems, and the anthems would give any good Anglican church a good run for their money. I mean, it's serious stuff, and that was very much what they were singing. These choirs were you know, very competent and sang some heavy duty anthems. So yes. Looking at Congregational Hymnary, and that'll give you a real feel for it, I think.
Thank you very much for that. And that's spot on in another respect. I think at the end of the war, after about 1920, the chairman of the Congregational Union, shortly before he died, was Sir John McClure, who was headmaster of Mill Hill School, the independent school in the north of London, which many Congregationalists, if they could afford it, sent their sons to. McClure was very actively behind, I think, that production of that congregational hymnary. So this, and it's interesting to see, I have followed the response of Mill Hill School looking at the school magazine to the Great War. And it is very interesting there to see all the elements that we've been discussing coming through. And that was a school that just before the war had begun to develop officers, you know, the cadet corps, the officers training corps. So this is an interesting aspect of, I was going to say not militarism, but you see how it becomes part of general thinking.
Are there any other questions from the floor? I don't want to miss anybody out. I'm just flicking between my screens here. No, that's brilliant. Well, so certainly speaking for myself, I think it's been such a fascinating, I mean, just such a vivid and colourful talk. Thank you very, very much, Professor Binfield. And just really fascinating to have such people at the talk with such varied experiences of Congregationalism as well. People who it's clear that it's your sort of, you've got lots of personal experience of the church and the faith, and other people who have been very involved in the research as part of the Organ Restoration Project. And other people, I can see faces who are members of St Mellitus's congregation as well in attendance, which is just so wonderful. So I think it's been all the richer for the variety of the people that have attended. So thank you very, very much to everyone for coming. As I say, this is all down, this whole event is all down to Karen Brookfield, one of our very industrious researchers on the project. So thank you to all of our researchers, but I know that Karen, you wanted to say a couple of words at the end of the session.
Yes, thank you, Emma. I'd like to thank everyone for coming as well. It's really lovely to see all our volunteers and also people who have other connections, and also one of a descendant of one of our soldiers who's with us today, which is really lovely. But Professor Binfield, mostly I'd like to thank you for a really inspiring talk, for picking up so many of the threads. You said at the beginning, let's imagine we are in the church, as we can't be there today. But I think you've really helped us feel that space, your knowledge of the architecture, and setting us off, certainly for me, to look into Searle and his connections. You've really set our musical heritage for us, which is absolutely wonderful, because that's something that as we turn to the official project is coming to a close and we turn to sustaining it, the music is absolutely vital to that. We're looking very hard at how we can sustain the use of the space and the organ, people coming to play it. And you've given us loads of things to pick up for concerts and ideas and projects. Thank you. You've given us the chemistry and the mulch for our further research. I've certainly got loads of ideas from what you said I'd like to pick up. And most of all, I'm going to pursue, just down the road from me is Ossian Road. We're very fond in our project of a book which is the street names of Islington. And we use that a lot to check on our soldiers. But Ossian is just on the Haringey side of the border, which goes down Stroud Green Road. So I'm going to go and personally pursue. In fact, I mean, there may be people who know, and John Hinshelwood, who knows pretty much everything there is to know about Hornsey, may know, but I'm going to go and pursue, is there a connection with Ossian Road? And I really hope there is. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much for giving up your Saturday morning for us, talking to us in such an inspirational way, and being a friend of the New Court St Mellitus Project, and we hope you'll stay a friend with us in the future. Thank you.